I'm Brian,
And I'm Gabby.
and this is our Ford Transit Connect that we've been living in.
She was young, full of life, and chasing adventure with the man she thought she'd spend forever with. But what started as a dream road trip spiraled into a chilling nightmare, one that the world watched unfold in real time. A love story turned deadly, the warning signs no one acted on, a murder that could have been prevented. Now Netflix is set to release American Murder, Gabby Petito on February 17th, 2025. A documentary revealing never-before-seen texts, diary entries, and interviews that expose the truth behind the case. But before it airs, we're diving into the real story, the shocking evidence, the unanswered questions, and the haunting details you may have missed. Because this isn't just a crime, it's a lesson, a warning, and a story that demands to be told. She had a spark, a warmth that made people gravitate toward her. Gabby Petito was more than just another face on social media. She was a daughter, a sister, a best friend, a young woman with dreams as big as the open road. She wanted adventure. She wanted to explore. She wanted a life that was different from the ordinary. And she thought she had found the perfect partner to share that journey with. Brian Laundrie, the boy she met in high school, the boy she fell in love with. To many, they seemed like the perfect couple, two young souls, deeply connected, inseparable. But appearances can be deceiving. They moved in together in Florida, living with Brian's parents, and from the outside looking in, it was a love story. But behind the scenes, cracks had already begun to form. Gabby's friends noticed how Brian could be controlling, how he would belittle her, how small things that shouldn't matter, would turn into problems. Still, Gabby believed in their love. She believed that Brian was just particular, that he just had a temper sometimes. She thought it was normal. And so, when they decided to set out on a cross-country road trip in July 2021, just the two of them, their van, and the open road, it seemed like a dream. They would document their travels, turning their Instagram pages into a picture-perfect scrapbook of their adventures. Smiling selfies, sunsets, national parks, a life of freedom. But behind the camera, behind those carefully curated moments, was another story, a story of jealousy, anger, and control. It started subtly, a quiet argument at a gas station, a tense moment when Brian didn't want Gabby talking to strangers. She brushed it off. Every couple has disagreements, right? But the fights kept happening. He would get frustrated over the smallest things, how she packed the van, how she looked at someone, how she spoke too loudly in public. And then, it got worse. August 12th, 2021, Moab, Utah. A 911 call comes in. A concerned witness reports seeing a man slap a woman in the middle of the street. They were fighting. He was hitting her. She was trying to get away.
We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl.
He was slapping her?
Yes, and then we stopped. They ran up and down the sidewalk. He proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off.
Okay, you said it's a white van?
Minutes later, police pulled over a white Ford Transit van matching the description. The body cam footage from that stop is now infamous. Gabby is crying, her body shaking as she wipes away her tears. She tells the officer she's struggling with her mental health, that she has OCD and sometimes gets overwhelmed. She blames herself for the argument. But look at Brian. His demeanor is different. He laughs. He jokes with the officers. He plays the part of the patient boyfriend dealing with an emotional partner. She gets worked up sometimes, he says casually. The police separated them for the night. No arrests were made. No real consequences. But what's most chilling is that Brian was already testing the limits, seeing just how much he could get away with. And soon, he would go even further. August 27th, 2021, Jackson, Wyoming. A small restaurant, the Merry Piglets. Witnesses recall seeing a couple arguing. But this wasn't just a typical lover's spat. This was different. Gabby was in tears, visibly shaken. Brian was aggressive. yelling at the staff, storming in and out of the restaurant. Why? What had triggered him? Was it something Gabby said? Someone she looked at? Something completely trivial? We may never know. What we do know is that Gabby left that restaurant in distress. The last time she was seen alive was just a few hours later. Then, silence. Her social media posts stopped. No more calls to her family. No more excited updates about her travels. And then, on August 30th, Gabby's mother received a text message. No service in Yosemite. It was strange. Yosemite? That wasn't where they were supposed to be. Something didn't feel right. And then there was the message from August 27th, the one that read, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." It was the first time she had ever referred to her grandfather by his first name. Her mother's stomach dropped. It wasn't Gabby. Someone else had sent that text. And by then, it was already too late. September 19th, 2021. Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming. The crisp mountain air carried an eerie silence as search teams moved carefully through the rugged terrain. For days, they had combed through the vast, unforgiving wilderness, desperate to find a trace of her, any sign that Gabby was still out there. But deep down, her family already knew. And then, they found her. A body, partially concealed, left in the open as if discarded. The elements had begun to take their toll, but there was no doubt. It was Gabby. The autopsy would later reveal what happened in those final moments. She had been manually strangled. No weapon, no sudden act of violence from a distance. This was up close, deliberate, personal. Strangulation is not an instant death. It takes minutes. 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes of pressure. Her gasping for air, her eyes locking onto the man she loved, silently pleading. It is not something that happens in the heat of the moment. It is not a reflex. It is a choice. Brian had to have felt her struggle. He had to have seen the life drain from her. And yet, he did not stop. What had led to that moment? Had they fought again? Had she told him she wanted to leave? Had she simply done something he didn't like? We will never know, because the only person who could have answered that question was already on the run. 2 days later, Brian Laundrie returned home to Florida, alone. He drove Gabby's van, the very same vehicle they had set out in together. He parked it in his parents' driveway, walked inside, and said nothing. No phone calls to her family, no frantic searches for a missing fiancé, just silence. And then, something even more chilling. Brian and his parents went camping. Just days after their son came home alone, while Gabby's family was desperately searching for her, the Laundries went on a trip to a nearby nature reserve. It was as if they were trying to live life as normal, pretending nothing had happened. And when the questions started coming, when the police knocked on their door, the Laundries refused to cooperate. Brian wasn't speaking. His parents weren't speaking. Gabby's family begged for answers. They pleaded with Brian to say something, anything, but he stayed hidden behind the walls of his parents' home, shielded from the growing storm outside. The world was watching. The story exploded across the media. People demanded justice. Social media became a battleground. Millions of amateur sleuths combing through old footage, old photos, analyzing body cam videos, trying to piece together the timeline. But Brian, he simply vanished. His parents claimed he had gone for a hike at the Carlton Reserve, a vast, swampy, alligator-infested area in Florida. He never returned. Days passed, then weeks. Had he fled the country? Was he hiding? Had he taken his own life? The theories ran wild. Law enforcement scoured the area. Search teams battled brutal terrain, waist-deep water, dangerous wildlife, and for weeks, nothing. Until finally, on October 20th, they found what was left of him. Skeletal remains, partially submerged, not far from where his parents claimed he had gone hiking. Nearby, a dry bag. Inside, his notebook. And in that notebook, a confession. Brian Laundrie admitted to killing Gabby, but the way he wrote about it was as disturbing as the act itself. He called it a mercy killing. He claimed she had been injured and was suffering, that he had no choice but to take her life. But the autopsy told a different story. Gabby had no injuries consistent with his claims, no broken bones, no wounds suggesting she had fallen or been hurt in some tragic accident. She had been strangled. This wasn't mercy, it was murder. And now there would be no trial, no courtroom drama, no questions answered. Brian had escaped justice the only way he could, by taking his own life. For Gabby's family, the nightmare didn't end with Brian's death. There was no closure, only more questions, more pain, more anger. They would never get to hear him explain why, never get to see him face the consequences of what he did, never get the justice they so desperately deserved. But they refused to let Gabby's story be forgotten. The discovery of Brian Laundrie's remains didn't feel like justice. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like an escape, an unfinished ending to a story that should have gone differently. He had taken the easy way out, leaving behind only fragments of his final thoughts, scribbled in a notebook that would never face cross-examination in a courtroom. The pages were soaked, damaged from the elements, but what was legible painted a picture of a man trying to rewrite history. Brian claimed Gabby had been injured, that she was in pain, and that he ended her life as an act of mercy. But the science, the facts, and the evidence told a different story. There was no accident, no medical emergency, just a brutal, intimate murder. A killing that required him to hold his grip long after Gabby had lost consciousness. And in the end, he wasn't strong enough to face the weight of what he had done. Authorities ruled Brian's cause of death as suicide, a single gunshot wound to the head. His remains were discovered in an area that had previously been underwater, making his body difficult to find until the floodwaters receded. But there was something else, something that didn't sit right with the world watching. His parents. They had been eerily silent throughout the entire investigation, refusing to speak, ignoring the cries of a grieving family, claiming they didn't know where Brian was, only to later lead authorities straight to the area where his remains were found. How? How did they know? Had they helped him? Had they known the truth from the beginning? Gabby's family had no doubt in their minds. The Laundries had protected their son until the very end. But now, with Brian gone, there would be no trial, no prosecution, no opportunity for Gabby's parents to look him in the eyes and demand the truth. The legal system would never get to hold him accountable, and that reality was unbearable. For the Petito family, the pain didn't fade, it deepened. The justice system wasn't built to handle situations like this. A killer who dies before facing trial leaves behind a void, an open wound that never truly heals. But they refused to let Gabby's story end in silence. They turned their grief into a mission, founding the Gabby Petito Foundation to help victims of domestic violence. They spoke out about the warning signs so many people missed, about the flaws in the legal system that failed to protect their daughter, about the need for change. And change did come. The case forced conversations across the country about coercive control, emotional abuse, and how many victims are trapped in relationships they don't know how to escape. But it wasn't enough. It will never be enough. Because at the center of this story is a young woman who should still be here. A woman who had her whole life ahead of her, whose laughter and adventurous spirit should never have been extinguished by the very person who claimed to love her the most. Gabby's family was left with memories, with pictures, with videos of a bright-eyed girl full of dreams that would never come true. And the hardest part? Knowing that it didn't have to happen this way. Had someone intervened sooner, had the authorities recognized the red flags, had Brian been held accountable before it was too late, Gabby might still be alive. Instead, all that remains is her story. A story of love turned into obsession, of control masquerading as care, of a woman who deserves so much more than the fate she was given. And that story must never be forgotten. The most unsettling thing about Gabby's story is how many chances there were to change the outcome. How many moments, small, seemingly insignificant moments, could have been the difference between life and death. It wasn't just about the physical violence. It was the control, the psychological grip Brian had over her. The way he isolated her, chipped away at her confidence, made her doubt herself. That's what people don't talk about enough. Abuse doesn't always start with bruises. It starts with words, manipulation, power. It starts when someone convinces you that their anger is your fault, that you need to change, that you are the problem. And that's what was happening with Gabby. We've all seen it. Friends who change when they're in a relationship, who go quiet, who make excuses for their partner's behavior, who slowly lose themselves. And most of the time, we brush it off. We don't want to intrude. We don't want to assume the worst. But what if someone had intruded? What if someone had seen the way Brian spoke to Gabby when no one else was around? What if someone had asked the right questions? Would she have told the truth? Would she have felt safe enough to leave? Leaving isn't easy. That's what so many people don't understand. It's not just about walking away. It's about breaking free from something that feels inescapable. It's about unlearning all the things an abuser has made you believe about yourself. Gabby didn't just love Brian, she thought she needed him. That's what he made her believe. And even when she had doubts, even when she knew something wasn't right, she kept going back. She kept trying to fix it. Because that's what victims do. They hold on to hope that things will get better. That if they just love hard enough, if they just try harder, the person they fell in love with will come back. But Brian was never going to change. That's the harsh truth. And it's the truth in so many abusive relationships. The person who hurts you once will hurt you again. The person who controls you in small ways will one day control you completely. The person who makes you feel worthless will never suddenly see your worth. But how do you make someone see that when they're in it? How do you pull them out before it's too late? That's the question people are still asking. And then there's Brian's parents. How much did they know? How much were they hiding? The way they stayed silent, the way they refused to help the search for Gabby, the way they protected their son while another family was living their worst nightmare. They had to know something. Did Brian confess to them the moment he got home? Did they help him cover his tracks? Or were they just so desperate to save their own son that they ignored the obvious? And then the so-called search for Brian, the weeks of speculation, the theories, the false sightings. And suddenly, when it seemed like the case was starting to slip from the headlines, his remains were found, right where his parents had claimed he was all along. How convenient. Did they know the whole time? Were they playing a game with the authorities? Buying time, waiting for the inevitable? There are so many unanswered questions. But one thing is certain. Gabby didn't have to die. Her story could have ended differently. She could have been here today, living the life she dreamed of, seeing the world, creating, inspiring. And that's why people can't stop talking about it. Because for every Gabby, there are thousands of others. Women, men, people who are trapped in relationships that seem fine on the outside, but are suffocating behind closed doors. People who don't know they're in danger until it's too late. People who need someone to see them, to believe them, to help them before their story ends in tragedy. So now, the question is, what do we do? Do we ignore the warning signs? Do we let history repeat itself? Or do we start paying attention? Comment below, let's talk about it. Was there a moment that could have saved Gabby? Should the police have done more? Should Brian's parents be held accountable? How do we stop this from happening again? Let's make sure this conversation never stops. Because silence is what lets things like this keep happening. And we owe it to Gabby, to every victim, to never let this happen again.